Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Blunting Occam's Razor. In this video, we're going to be looking at the difference between elegance and parsimony. Now, a key distinction to make before we dig into definitions of simplicity is the difference between elegance and parsimony. While in many instances parsimony is taken to be synonymous with simplicity at large, when you say the principle of parsimony, people understand you're talking about simplicity in general. In other writings, parsimony is taken to be a specific type of simplicity that is contrasted with elegance. For the purposes of this series, we will treat them as two different varieties of simplicity, with parsimony focusing on what might be classified as ontological simplicity, and elegance describing what might be classified as semantic simplicity. In short, elegance is the number of hypotheses, axioms, or assumptions that you need to make, while parsimony is the number of entities posited by a particular theory. In this video, we're going to look at each type of simplicity on its own, how they interact, and how one might compare them. Now, as we're defining it here, parsimony is synonymous with ontological simplicity. In other words, how many types of things does your theory posit? Occam's razor focused on parsimony might state that a theory should not posit more entities than necessary. Or, under some formulations, the slightly weaker version, if two theories are otherwise equal, the one that posits fewer entities is rationally preferable. For most, these entities don't need to be explicitly stated in a theory, but rather they are the things that one is ontologically committed to. Your theory is ontologically committed to something if your theory entails that thing exists. Now, there's a question as to whether these entities refer to the types of entities or tokens of entities. In other words, if one theory posits 100 things, but all of those things are one type of thing, while a second theory posits two things of different types, which is simpler, the one that posits 100 things of one type or two things each of different types. Generally, parsimony is understood to refer to types, not tokens, and so the second theory, despite only positing two things, would be more complicated because it posits two different types of things. So a theory is simpler if it refers to fewer types of things. We're going to discuss this distinction in the challenges it poses more in the video on the problem of numeric parsimony. So check out that for more information when we get to it, but you can also check out our video on the type versus token distinction if that distinction isn't clear here. However, this response raises more questions than it answers, since kinds can be defined in any number of ways. A philosopher might divide everything into two kinds, mental and physical, claiming that anything that is physical is of one kind, and so positing additional physical objects doesn't count against a theory of parsimony. However, physicists might argue that individual subatomic particles are the underlying kinds, and theories which posit more types of subatomic particles are more complex, even though they are all physical things. The chemist then might argue that elements are the types of things we could concern ourselves with, despite them being simply arrangements of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Is a new element really a new kind of thing, or just a rearrangement? Well, when we look around us, it seems like elements behave in a very pre-theoretical way very differently, like different kinds of things, but are they the same kinds of difference as protons and neutrons, which in some ways seem very similar? If so, are even these particles real kinds, or just rearrangements of the subatomic particles themselves? It seems nigh impossible to find an objective definition or determination of how many types of things an individual theory posits, because depending on where you cut those lines, where you decide we're talking about kinds, what different particular discipline you're in, we're going to describe any given theory as having a different number of things, or a different number type of things, let alone compare the number posited by two competing theories and choose the more parsimonious one. Check out our video on natural kinds for more on this and some of the challenges with dividing these up. Ontological parsimony is contrasted with syntactical parsimony, or elegance. Elegance in this context means the number and complexity of the hypotheses or axioms that are assumed in a theory. At first glance, such a principle may seem in line with, or even justified by, the skeptic's concerns. If there is worry that assuming things without evidence is bad, it might seem that the fewer things we assume, the better. Most logical and scientific systems need to assume some basic axioms to function: the laws of logic, the scientific method, Euclidean postulates, background paradigmatic beliefs, etc. The principle of elegance states that we should keep those underlying assumptions to the minimum required. However, There are at least three challenges to this. First is the problem of the principle of explosion. From the faults, anything follows. Second is the problem of separating out individual hypotheses from each other. What makes a hypothesis importantly separate from another, such that they should be counted individually? Finally, there's the issue of measuring the complexity of a statement, something that is certainly more an art than a science. So first off, the principle of explosion shows that if you even assume one false claim, you can use the deductive rules of logic to infer absolutely anything you want. What this means is that even a single false statement is sufficient to lead to any statement in a belief system being false. There's no marginal benefit from more or fewer unjustified or false assumptions in your initial axioms, because as long as you have at least one, you've got a problem. If any of them are false, the entire system can draw any conclusions. This undermines the idea of elegance as a virtue for a theory, at least beyond the basic binary of whether anything was assumed as an axiom. As long as at least something was assumed without argument, there's no reason to believe that the conclusions drawn from that assumption are true. The second concern is around separation. What makes something two separate hypotheses? The fact that they can be separated. If I say all x's are y's and z's, that is able to be separated into all x's are y's and all x's are z's. Should this count as two separate propositions? If so, there are many different propositions that could be considered separable. We could further separate out all x's are y's and z's to different types of x's. If we want to split that down, it could be all x's that are in this part of the world, all x's that are in that part of the world, all these things. We can split propositions down quite a lot. And so there doesn't seem to be a way that we could say, well, how much should you really be splitting things down? It's often possible to make something more complicated while saying the same thing. If, when we are counting individual axioms, we want to make sure we consider the most broken down constituent parts, that may include quite a few axioms, even for something that seems inconspicuous. Conversely, if we're allowing hypotheses to be conjoined together, it seems like the way to reduce the number of axioms you need is to list them all as one strain of P and Q and R and S and so on, so you're only stating one axiom. It seems that the number of axioms we assume is much more built on the person that's deciding how to build them and how much we're allowed to smush them together or not than anything inherent about the simplicity of the theory. This feeds into the last problem, how we can decide if a particular hypothesis is complex or not. Certainly there's a degree to which, if it can be broken down into constituent parts, it is complex. But it seems like there is more that we can mean by complexity than simply how much it can be unpacked. As we said, you have a universal generalization over a lot of individual things. You could theoretically split that down into every single one of those things. Something might be a whole theory that cannot be broken apart, but is still very difficult to understand, or deals with many different subjects, and therefore is very complex despite not being something you could really break down. It seems like that would be complex, but there's no clear objective standard to judge such complexity against. If I give you a particular hypothesis, how much complexity does it have? It's really hard to say, and it's hard to say if it's more complex than another theory, unless they are so similar as it to be absolutely clear that this one theory posits exactly these things and says exactly this, the other theory does exactly the same thing and just adds one piece on at the end. That's the only situation where you could really define one as clearly more complex than the other. Finally, this leads to the challenge of which should be preferable, elegance or parsimony. Is a theory that posits many different types of things, but does it in only a few simple hypotheses, preferable to a theory that posits only one type of thing, but has many different hypotheses that we need to assume? Does abiding by a particular principle of parsimony mean a particular one of these conceptions or some combination of both? If you say, I accept Occam's razor, which are you talking about? Are you talking about some combination of parsimony and elegance? Are you talking about both of them at the same time? Are you talking about only one? Is one in some way more justified than the other? Should we just care about parsimony? Should we just care about elegance? In the coming videos, we're going to look at potential justifications for these definitions of parsimony and some further concerns you might have with them. Is either elegance or parsimony more persuasive to you as an understanding of Occam's razor? How would you define your preferred concept? Would it be elegance, parsimony, or some combination of both? Would it be in terms of types or tokens? In terms of the number of axioms or the complexity of those axioms? How would you define how complex an axiom is? How would you separate out what an individual thing is, an individual type of thing. Is it mental versus physical? Is it individual subatomic particles? Is it different elements on the periodic table? How would you separate these things out? Give me your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org. Subscribe if you like this video and you want to see more. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the rest of the videos in our series, Blunting Occam's Razor, on simplicity. And as always, stay skeptical, everybody.